We're electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Oh, God. It's kind of chilly over here in the UK, Tim. Especially at night. Looks like the fog should start rolling in pretty soon. And look over there. That lighthouse looks really spooky tonight. You can almost imagine that it's a UFO peeking through the mist.
Well, Tim, give me those binoculars. Yep,
okay.
Just what I thought. That isn't a lighthouse. It is a UFO.
No.
Yeah. They're pretty much proven that you can't see the beacon out in the woods because of a metal plate that blocks it when the light revolves in our direction.
Okay. Well, that's sure strange looking, and the military base has been closed down for years. You would think the saucer people would keep a safe distance from us creepy tourists.
Looks like it's ready to land in the clearing over there. Should we approach the craft and welcome whoever steps out? So we could be dealing with time travelers, men from another planet, or possibly even a hologram projected by a secret branch of the CIA.
Well, okay, maybe our special guest tonight can fill us in on the details. I say we split like the wind and head back to the KCOR studios in balmy Las Vegas.
I'm with you there. Let's get the hell out of here and get back to balmy Vegas, just like you said.
Okay. This is much better.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's pretty hot out in the desert.
Yeah, but it's a dry heat, Tim.
Oh, I hear that. I hear that all the time. It's a dry heat. Yeah. Well, it's not that dry. Anyway, I'm looking for a big swimming pool.
Well, just come and join me here in southern Indiana, Tim, and you just stand out in my backyard, and the air around you, it's like one big swimming pool.
Wow, there you go. Anyway, Tim, how you doing these days?
I'm doing fine. It's like I said, it's a typical summer in Indiana. So you don't need a swimming pool. Just go outside and enjoy the humidity.
Well, there you go. And Bigfoot is out in all his glory.
I have not seen Bigfoot around here. Now, some big Black Panther types of beasties have been seen around here, but it's been a long time since there's been any Bigfoot in southern Indiana.
Well, I'm sure that we can conjure up a few. Anyway, Tim, we have an old friend on this evening, a friend of the show and a friend of us for many years now. Nick Redfern. That's right, Nick Redfern.
There you go.
And why don't you give us a skinny on the mini and tell us what Nick has been up to?
All right. Well, yeah, like you said, Nick Redfern's our guest tonight. I really don't think that I have to go into too much because he is well known amongst all of us and all of our listeners. But Nick is a full-time author and journalist, specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, UFO sightings, government conspiracies, and other paranormal phenomena. Tonight, we'll be talking about his most recent books, the Rendlesham Forest, UFO Conspiracy, A Close Encounter Exposed as a Top Secret Government Experiment. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about his new book, Monsters of the Deep, which is set to be released next week on August 4th. So, Nick, great to have you back on Exploring the Bizarre.
Hey guys, well, thanks for having me on again.
Well, you bet your life. Hey, I got to ask you this, Nick. I mean, I got to ask you this. I mean, you could have picked any UFO case to write about. You got the material and the resources. Why in God's name did you pick Rendlesham, which has been written about so many times? And I must say that I kind of feel responsible, or at least semi-responsible, for bringing that case to the attention of the American public. because I published Jenny Randall's book on it from Out of the Blue and sold the paperback rights. And of course, we've had Peter Robbins on many, many times, and I still consider myself a close friend of Larry Warren. And in fact, when Jim Burrows came back from his from Europe, he moved to the Phoenix area, and we just happened to be having a UFO conference out there. So lo and behold, I invited Burroughs and Larry Warren to debate on stage. And that was the first time they had met each other or for many, many years. But again, why did you pick that case, and what can you tell us that's new about Bentwaters?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that Rendlesham as a case is sort of up there, you know, along with Roswell and the Betty and Bardi Hill case, in terms of people knowing the story and it having become sort of like an iconic case within ufology. But as I'm sure you know, Tim, that over the years, rumours have circulated that maybe Rendlesham wasn't a UFO event, but was a top-secret military experiment using holograms and hallucinogenics, and the reason to essentially to be test these technologies in a domestic situation on your own troops, on your own personnel, and see how they respond to completely fabricated but amazing events, and see how, you know, the enemy would respond on the battlefield. And you can find snippets of these rumors of secret experiments in most of the writings that's been done in various places and times going back to the early 1980s. But the intriguing thing is, within ufology, a lot of people just did not want to touch this idea that Rendlesham was not a classic UFO after all, but could have been something even more disturbing. And I thought, well, nobody's really tackled this sort of other angle, you know, kind of like the elephant in the room, that sort of situation. Nobody wanted to touch it. So I thought, well, it's about time somebody did touch it, you know, and so that's what I did. I sort of followed every thread and lead, various interviews with people, and put together within the book what I believe is the full story, or the correct story, that it was some sort of like a psychological warfare experiment designed to see how personnel on the battlefield would respond to tactic and bizarre situations.
We've heard, but you know, we've heard this kind of same scenario before. I mean, Howard Menger, of course, who was one of the best-known contactees of the 60s and 70s. You know, at first he claimed to have met the very wonderful space woman that landed in his backyard in his apple orchard there in Highbridge, New Jersey. And he sat on the rock and was mesmerized by her Aryan beauty. And he had subsequent, contacts, he claimed. But then when Gray Barker published his book, From Outer Space to You, suddenly he wasn't available for interviews. And for a while, at least, he was suggesting that there was some sort of government, I don't know if you would say intervention, but he was asked to throw these stories out there to see what kind of reaction would come about. But we don't know if that's true or not. And then lo and behold, he went back on the lecture circuit and went back to telling pretty much his original stories with the additional details of visitstellar planets and also free energy devices. I remember he came to a conference in San Diego with a trailer behind his car, which he had driven all the way from Vero Beach, Florida. It took him a couple extra days to get there, with a model of his saucer-shaped craft. So we have heard scenarios like that before, but what actual evidence do you have that might be the case in this a very important incident?
Well, one of the intriguing things, which a lot of people either overlook or don't even know, is the nature of the location, Rendlesham Forest. Now, a lot of people think it's just, this sort of typical large English piece of forest, which in one sense it is. But if you look at the history of the area, going back to the 1930s, just a handful of miles from Rendlesham Forest, a secret organisation was set up in the 30s called the Tizard Committee, which was one of the first British research projects into radar. Then in the height of the Second World War, again, just about 4 or 5 miles from Rendlesham Forest, there was a testing of a technology which is still kind of very much under wraps, that actually sort of it was designed to sort of set the water of the English Channel, localized areas, in case the Germans tried to invade on the beaches of England. They would use this sort of strange flame-like technology. And this occurred at a place called Shingle Street. And if you Google Shingle Street secret experiments, you'll find a lot of material about it. And then in the 60s, there was other radar experiments in the area, and Marconi had a facility there as well. Now, if you put all that together, what you actually have is a situation where 4 or 5 of the biggest, most top secret experimental facilities on the east coast of England were all situated less than 10 miles from Rendlesham Forest. So in other words, the whole area has been a hotbed of classified experiments going back to the Tizard Committee in the 1930s. Now, on top of that, as far as the hologram angle is concerned, this angle of the story has popped up here and there, now and again, quietly and sometimes not so quietly. The first person who was told about this was Ray Boucher, one of the early researchers into Rendlesham after it broke.
Yeah, in fact, he's coming
Ray
on our show in a couple of weeks. Yeah, he'll be on our show.
Oh, cool. That's good.
Yeah. Finally got him. Yep.
That's good. Well, Ray was one of the first people to address this. He was actually approached. You might want to bring this up with him.
Yeah, absolutely.
In 1991, he had a meeting with 2 U.S. Department of Defense personnel who basically wanted to tell him the truth of Rendlesham. And he was told that, yes, it was a hologram-based operation, like psychological warfare mixed in with a little bit of MK Ultra, next generation MK Ultra type technology, to see how the mind of the people could be transformed or changed or messed around with, and do so on the battlefield to freak out the enemy. And so I extensively investigated this angle of Ray's story, and he told me also how he spoke with his own senator in the area, and how it really got into a strange situation where it seemed like he was under surveillance because he'd been given this story and he was digging into it even further. And then on top of that, one of the other areas which is intriguing is that we know that in the area on the time of the events, a team was sent out from a place in England called Porton Down. And Porton Down is a top secret facility which does research into, actually in the 50s, it started in the 50s doing research like LSD tests and hallucinogens, things like this. And one of the pieces of data that I found was that actually a team of scientists and personnel from Porton Down came out to Rendlesham Forest, not while the events were going on or in the immediate aftermath, but they were actually there before the events occurred. And the story is that they essentially set up the situation and to allow this project to go ahead, and for the victims, which is probably the best way to describe them, unfortunately, the idea was to lure the guys into the woods and to see how they would respond to this combination of holograms and MK Ultra type hallucinogens from Porton Downs. So there's a lot of new material, which for me at least, sort of pushes it still further down that pathway of an experiment rather than extraterrestrials.
Now, do you think that, of course, we have a few participants that are well known to the public. We have Larry Warren, we have Jim Peniston, we have Jim Burroughs, and we have Colonel Halt. Do you think that Colonel Halt, for example, was in on this?
No, I don't. I think the reason why the program or this experiment or series of experiments worked, I think the reason why they worked is because the guys who were there and who became part of it were specifically not told. I think had they been told, I don't think it could have been pulled off, or some of them would have spoken about it being a secret experiment. So I don't think they were involved. I mean, they were involved in the event, but I don't believe they were involved in orchestrating all this. I think it's the exact opposite, actually. But I mean, it's interesting when you bring up those names, because when you look at a number of the guys who we know were there, for example, I mean, Halt himself talked about how he suspected that Larry Warren had his mind meddled with. Mm-hmm. And Jim Peniston talked about when the military were asking him for his opinion on what happened, he was basically given a truth drug. And there are rumors of other military personnel being subjected to sodium, what's it called? The truth drug, anyway.
Sodium pentothal. Yeah, sodium pentothal.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at the story, you have this thread going through the story of Rendlesham of some of the guys having their minds messed around with one way or another. And again, I think that's intriguing, because you rarely find that even in, UFO case involving the military. You don't find many of these cases where suddenly, sodium pentothal pops up, other truth drugs, and from that perspective, you can look at those questionings, when they're under sodium pentothal, to determine how accurate and how successfully the experiments worked. If the guys said, yes, we saw this strange UFO and this weird fog in the woods and lights in the sky, then they gave them a good ability, if you like, to determine how successful the programs were.
Okay, so now, can you point to any other cases where you think there might have been similar manipulation?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look out, throughout history of ufology of the last 50, 60 years, I mean, there are a few cases that fall into that particular category. I mean, people won't probably like this when I bring up yet another classic case.
Betty and Barney Hill?
Well, actually, I mean, yes, but the one I was actually going to say right now was the Parker Hickson case of 1973 in Mississippi. Now, what's particularly intriguing about that case is, you've got Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson sat, by the edge of the river, just like 9 o'clock at night, just fishing, having a good time. They suddenly see this strange light, and then things go weird, and they have what appears to be like a classic UFO alien abduction. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I find intriguing about this case is that barely just a handful of miles from the area where they were fishing and where they were taken from is actually very close to a place called Horn Island. And Horn Island in the 1950s through the 60s was a classified area where a lot of research was done, again, into hallucinogens and mind-altering technology. And that's a factual piece of history. Now, we could say that it's just coincidence that the Hickson Parker event occurred just a few miles from Horn Island, or you could say that's a classic example of putting the two pieces together and making four. And I mean, I haven't sort of dug very deeply into the whole issue of the interrupted journey, Betty and Barney Hill, John Fuller, etc., etc. But what is intriguing is that we know now through the Freedom of Information Act that, that in the mid 1950s, none other than John Fuller was actually briefed by military intelligence and the CIA about the then present research into things like MK Ultra and LSD and mind-altering technologies.
He even wrote that book about the city in France where everybody danced in the street and hallucinated because they were eating the bread that had been tainted.
Yeah, that's a little village actually in France, and where in 1951 something went severely weird in this little village in France, and there were rumours that it was actually like an aerosol-based deployment of hallucinogens, and again that it was done to see how quickly and how effectively effects could, change people's mindsets. And some of them actually died. Others were in psychiatric hospitals for days and weeks. And so, in other words, there are a number of cases within ufology that I'm suspective. I sort of suspect that they may not be what they appear to be. Now, I wouldn't want people to think, I've sort of changed all my views on ufology. I haven't. There's no doubt in my mind that there is a genuine, real, unknown UFO phenomenon, whether extraterrestrial, multidimensional, interdimensional, I don't know. But there is a real phenomenon. But what I think has happened is that agencies and departments, they know there's a real UFO phenomenon, but at times they've sort of hijacked the real phenomenon as a means, and it's done as a means to cover up their military experiments by using a UFO banner. And because there's a real phenomenon, it works really well.
All right, let me interrupt you here because we have to go to our bottom of the hour break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Nick Redfern on Exploring the Bizarre, so stay tuned.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz. Tonight our guest is Nick Redfern. And Nick, we've got a couple of questions from our listeners, but I wanted to ask you first before we get into the questions. Why do you think that if this was some kind of military experiment, why do you think that they used the UFO scenario for this?
Well, I think more than anything else, it was because it was something that would really sort of have people, just standing there with their mouths wide open, and some of them certainly in a state of shock at what they were seeing. And I think that was the particular reason that they needed some kind of technology, and actually not so much the technology. What they wanted was to see the response to the experiment. So in other words, if they panicked and ran or fell to the ground or started crying, or if they just stood their ground and did, what troops do, that's sort of, defend their fellow troops. So I think that's the reason it was used. The weirder the experiments, the weirder the holographs, the more and more you can gauge the extent to which the human mind can be messed around with and screwed with, to the point where they are, as I said, in a state of terror. And of course, if that can be applied to your own personnel, then that would give you a good idea as to how you could use that same scenario, say, on the Russians,
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, our listener, Cosmonaut 57, wants to know what is the latest on the binary code story? And you'll have to give a little detail to our listeners who may not be familiar with that.
Yeah. Well, this particular angle of the binary code aspect of the Rendlesham case, this actually relates to Jim Penniston. And Jim Penniston was one of the key figures involved in the event itself when it occurred in December 1980. And, there was a group of people out there in the woods, and he was one of them. And Jim Penniston has this... the one aspect more than any other, as it relates to his involvement in Rendlesham, revolves around this binary code angle, where he was essentially, as he felt, that he had this sort of imagery and scenario in his mind, which suggested that the Rendlesham case was not a UFO event, but was actually a case of time travelers, human time travelers, coming back to the 20th century from whichever era they came from, because the future was supposedly a bleak and dark place, and the human race was on a waning situation, and so they come back to take DNA, cells, etc., to try and beef up us in the future. So, in other words, that is another scenario in relation to Rendlesham. You've got the UFO angle, the secret experiment angle, time travelers. Now, they cannot obviously all be correct. And so, in other words, you have to sort of try and figure out which one actually is. I mean, it's like Roswell. You've got aliens, crash test dummies, Russian balloons, secret American balloons. They can't all be correct, but somewhere the answer's there.
Well,
Nazis.
Yeah, there you go. But Penniston, he didn't come out with that story till quite a while later, after the original experience.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, with the binary code. Yes,
mm-hmm.
And,
well, which makes you wonder if these people are still being messed with, possibly.
Well, I mean, we never know for sure until the people actually come forward, and the ones who may still be meddled with. If they come forward and say, "Yes, I am," or "I've been told to do this or that," I mean, we'll never know unless they come forward. But for me, it's intriguing that there are so many different theories. I mean, I'm sure Tim remembers that when Jenny Randalls was and Dot and Brenda were doing their research, there were rumours going about early stealth plane crashing in the woods. There was talk about portions of a Russian satellite coming down in the area. There were so many different theories, and I have to think or wonder or suspect that at least some of these stories were put out there to confuse everybody by just swamping it with not just one or two theories or scenarios, but like 9 or 10 of them altogether.
Now, Jeff in the chat room has asked if you've spoken to former Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt about all of this, about your ideas.
Well, the last time I spoke to Charles Halt was round about 15 months ago. Then this was in person at a place in South Texas called Edinburgh. There's a conference that's put on there every year called the Out of the World Conference. And we were both speaking at that event last year. around about March, I think it was, or April. And, we got talking, as you do at conferences. Everybody has a few drinks and something to eat, and hang out. And so it was very much sort of not just about the conferences. It was a good hangout type situation as well. And I found it intriguing that when we got into the issue of Larry Warren, because there's been a lot of controversy about Larry in the last couple of years, but Charles Halt told me he still felt that at some point Larry's mind had been meddled with. So I find that kind of fascinating. That
but if you remember in the beginning, he's claimed that Larry Warren was not even stationed on the base at the time, which turned out to be a fabrication, but of course he was. Now, I think, and I understand that there's a conflict now between Peter Robbins and Larry, and I try to keep my friendship with both of them for sure. But back during the time of the UFO flap over Westchester in New York, the triangles and all, there was this meeting at the Brewster Middle School, and Larry Warren stood on the stairs of that middle school in front of myself and Betty Hill and maybe about 30 or 40 people, and told that story for the first time, and he's never backed down on it. If it was not for Larry, the case probably there's a good possibility that the case would never have been made public.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. I mean, if you look at the timeline of
the whistleblower, he was the whistleblower. He gave somebody else the story. They sold it to the News of the World and got paid like what was it, 10 or 1,500 pounds or something on it, and Larry made nothing on it. He's never, as far as I can tell, ever profited on this, because how do you really profit on it? I mean, they wrote a book, but I guess it made it to the top of the charts in England, but that's not like a lot of copies like you would have here.
Well, yeah, actually the book is not available now. It's been taken down by the publisher, and that Peter wanted that done, so that was taken down. I mean, you can still get copies, obviously, but the publisher, doesn't still put copies out there directly itself. You'd find it in used bookstores.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
Like yeah, but yeah, I mean, I sort of go back to the caller's question. Yes, as I said, I did speak to Charles Halt the most recent time about 15 months ago, and he was still talking about that angle of Larry at somehow having his mind meddled with. And as we said earlier in the show, that angle of mind manipulation, sodium pentothal, MK Ultra type spin-offs. There's so many aspects of mind-altering technology that sort of permeates throughout the Rendlesham case.
Well, speaking of mind control, some of the victims, participants, however you want to refer to them, later came down with various kinds of physical ailments, which makes me wonder whether or not they had been exposed to, say, like microwave or electromagnetic types of radiation, which we know that the CIA with their MK Ultra and other types of research were experimenting with those, and our listener Cosmonaut 57, is asking about the Marconi mystery deaths, which could be fall right into the same kind of categories.
Well, it's funny that you should bring that up because there's a place not too far away from Rendlesham Forest, Martlesham Heath, where research was actually done at that facility by some of the people who worked with Marconi. And I actually talk about one of the people in the book who died under mysterious circumstances and who actually worked not too far from Rendlesham Forest. So again, you've got this this sort of ongoing thread of secret experiments all surrounding Rendlesham Forest and that particular location.
Well, and a lot of those scientists and engineers, I mean, weren't they working for the Strategic Defense Initiative for the United States, or participating in research along those lines?
Yeah, that's correct. The SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan, was, in simple terms, it was referred to, a slang term, it's like Star Wars. And the plan was to have these sort of laser technology that would blast Russian missiles out of the sky, and not a single one, would reach the Western world. And but what's intriguing was this situation where a lot of these Marconi scientists and technicians, some of them working in the US, so been going over there for a few months working, but most of them based in the UK. And between the early 1980s, the early 1970s, right through to 1993, there was more than 30 scientists and technicians who died under really weird circumstances, just like, for example, sudden suicides, by people who just had regular, normal lives. There was one guy got in his car, going to work, then he suddenly stopped the car and got out, and he'd also got a rope in the back of the trunk of the car, and put one end of the rope around his neck, another one of them, the other end attached to a street lamp, hit the accelerator and decapitated himself. Just bizarre stories like this. And there were like 4 or 5 who killed themselves through carbon monoxide by sitting in the car with the garage door down and pipes, tubes, going into the car and killing them. Now, in one case, really bizarre story, the neighbours could hear the car going, and, the engine was rumbling, the lights were on, and obviously something was going on. And so the police were on the scene and quickly got the garage door open, and sure enough, there was a tube going into the window, and the guy was dead. But they couldn't find him. It took like 5 minutes to find him. He actually wasn't sat in the car. He was lying prone, flat, underneath the car. You wouldn't think to look under the car, and that's exactly what happened. The police were thinking, well, where is he? He's not in the driver's seat. And then they found him flat under the car. And there were so many bizarre suicides and weird deaths surrounding all those Marconi people. When you've got more than 30 across 27, 28 years, then you have to think that were their minds sort of stimulated by possibly something like a Manchurian Candidate type situation. You use a trigger word or something like that, and the person snaps into a completely different mindset.
Well, and as well as I do, that it has long been rumored that at the time, both the United States and the Soviet Union were basically having a mind control war with each other, using various techniques against scientists and military personnel, back and forth. And this, to me, sounds very much like one of those types of situations, with Rendlesham then being, I guess our side with an experiment to see what we could do down the road with Soviet Russia.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, the more you look into this, the more you begin to realize that, what we thought passed for ufology actually isn't ufology, or at least parts of it aren't. Some of it is sort of, created technology using the UFO motif as a camouflage, as I said. And it's sort of a classic way of hiding secret military technology and projects. You just place it under the cover of something else, and if somebody comes looking, it was aliens,
Yes, it's always aliens. So now, okay, this book came out in April, and what's the reaction been after you published it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, throughout April and May, I was sort of nearly every day. I was sort of doing Q&As, radio, and also, there was numerous debates on Facebook and elsewhere what people thought about it. And for the most part, I was sort of perceived as being, the next worst thing to like Saddam Hussein. How dare you say this, Nick, and say that, and are the CIA paying you and all this nonsense, But what I found fascinating was the sheer defensive nature of so many of these people who weren't even going to give even a thought about this, or even look at it from the perspective, well, maybe Nick has got it right. No, they were just so defensive, and this just cannot be. This cannot be the answer. We don't want to know. And in some cases, it really was like that. They just did not want to know because of the whole angle of destroying belief systems. And that tells you a lot as well. When you've got structured, strong belief systems, and then they come tumbling down, people either go tumbling with them or they deny it. And that was something, that cropped up time and time again. And as I said, another one that often pops up in ufology, as I said, that issue, Nick's, working for the CIA or the NSA or whatever, which is, it's sort of like a cheap shot. I mean, I wrote the book because I felt the data was strong enough to go down that particular avenue and to write a book that demonstrated why I thought it was a secret experiment. There was no hidden agenda. It was, I think this is what it is, so why not tell people? But the problem is, ufology is very much like a religion. It's belief-driven, and people don't like their beliefs questioned.
They're separate, sacred cows slaughtered, so to speak. We only have really, just a handful of minutes left in the show, but I wanted to ask you real quick about the book that you've got coming out, August the 4th, just next week.
Well, yeah, that's my other big interest beyond ufology is cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals, like Bigfoot, the Chupacabra, the Yeti, things like that. And I've got a new book coming out next week called Monsters of the Deep. Mm-hmm. And it's a study of lake monsters, sea serpents, huge fish that were thought to be extinct for millions of years, but which actually aren't extinct, and legends of things like the Kraken, and so it looks at the whole issue of water-based monsters, and it's published by Visible Ink Press, and it runs to about 400 pages, so it's a large sort of encyclopedic type book.
That's a big book. I didn't realize. Yeah, I didn't realize there were that many lake and sea monsters out there.
Well, I mean, when you look at it, everybody thinks of like Ogopogo, Champ, and the Loch Ness Monster. They're sort of the most famous lake monsters. But throughout the world, you can find lake monster stories in Canada, in Russia, much of South America. And, in some cases, I think they could well be unknown animals. Some of them could be creatures that we assume have become extinct but are still around. And some of them may be just animals that science has not classified at all yet. But I'll sort of address not just the cases, but some of the weirder and lesser known aspect of these stories. Like, for example, Aleister Crowley, for a number of years, had a house at Loch Ness called Boleskine House, and he performed all sorts of rituals and rites at Loch Ness. And so this has given rise to some researchers. They think the creatures that live in Loch Ness could be more supernatural based rather than flesh and blood. So, you've got the connections with Crowley and the idea that some of these creatures are supernatural rather than just unknown. And so there's a lot of weird unknown aspects or lesser known aspects. And so with the book, I've sort of split it into things like giant squid and giant octopus, sea serpents, lake monsters, and also things like the reptilians, and from the perspective of reptiles, obviously spending a lot of time in water as well. So.
All right, well that's fantastic. I look forward to reading that, Nick, when it comes out. Thanks. All right, Tim, we got about 2 minutes left in the show.
Well, I just want to remind people that we've been fairly active. Tim, ourselves, we've been very busy publishing 2 or 3 books a month. We have one out by Sean Castile, which delves into biblical prophecy, Armageddon, and the Marian phenomena, but not so much from a religious point of view, but from a non-sectarian phenomena point of view. And then, of course, there's your big book of alien encounters, which is doing very well. And I keep getting emails on that all the time, wondering when you might be working on another volume like that. And I know we're starting to put together, I guess I can reveal the title, UFO Spin Doctors.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one. I'm looking forward to.
And then, of course, the Diane Testman's transformational book, which goes into her life story. You talk about the future man and time travel. She's written a book on the subject, and this will be her life story about her many contacts with Tibus and other worldly beings.
All right. Well, we've got to wrap it up here, Tim. So, Nick, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Had a great time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
See you in Rendlesham.
Good night, all.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.